Oh, and let me mention along those lines, since we're not going to be in town next week, Hugh is going to have a lesson next week on this system. We are trying to work through the details of how to do that, and you'll get a message sometime during the week letting you know whether we're how we're going to do the next week without me being here. But we're hoping that's going to be pretty straightforward. But look for an email sometime during the week for clarity on that. All right, Revelation chapter 12. So let me adjust my screen. Okay, so as we remember, chapter 11 was the big climax of the book as Jesus takes over. We then, as I've said, kind of backtrack a little bit. We get into 12 and 13 here. We're really looking back at Satan and his role during all of this. We have we talk about a war that breaks out here in chapter 12, but we know the end of the war. That again is chapter 11, verse 15, when Christ takes over. So even though there's a war going on, we know that how that war actually finishes. We've seen in the past already, what God's activity was in judgment and in sealing the saints. Now we're going to look and see what Satan was doing during this time. And I will just remind you that Satan has always been against God's elect. Ever since the beginning. We have Satan certainly tried to disrupt Adam and Eve in the garden, right, in making Eve's sin and Adam's sin. You've got then, if you remember, Satan trying to destroy heaven when he brought some of the angels down with him. Had the angels interacting with men in weird ways, and just it's been his task to destroy God's plan from the beginning, and we see him very active in doing that. We'll talk a lot more about that here in chapter 12. So as we get into chapter 12 and 13, we're introduced to some new characters, and we've got to understand who those characters are. In chapter 12, we've got the woman that we'll talk about quite a bit. We've got the dragon, the red dragon. We've got the male child, and we've got Michael. And then when we go into chapter 13 and 14, we'll be introduced to the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth. And again, we'll have to understand who all of those folks are. So let's dive in. Let's look at chapter 12, verse 1 in a little bit, and then we'll look at it in more detail. So chapter 12, verse 1. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she bore a male child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. And then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So let's just pause right there and go back a little bit. So we do have to identify these players. The first one being the woman. You notice that she's called it's a great sign that has appeared in heaven. So this is it's a sign, right? She is an image of something else. There are 7 signs in Revelations. This is the first of those that we see as we go through the rest of the book. We'll be talking more about those. There are several different women in Revelation, and they're different women. The first one we actually saw back in chapter 2, which was it was 2:20. It was Jezebel, which was really a symbol of paganism that was in the church, in that particular church at that time. When we get to chapter 17, we'll hear all about the Scarlet Woman, which is really the apostate church at that time. And then in chapter 19, verse 7, we'll hear about the wife of the Lamb, which of course is the church. So all of these women in Revelations, and then here we have a different woman who is different from those three that we've just read about. So let me, before we jump into some of the details, let me just hear what you guys think. Who is this woman that we see here in chapter 12? Any guesses?
I was thinking Israel, because
Israel?
it's giving birth to Christ,
Okay.
coming to the land.
That's certainly one of the good interpretations. Any other thoughts? That's good.
Stephanie says that we cheated, and you already told us it was Israel, so she knows the answer.
She cheated.
Well, you told us before. I took notes.
All right. Any other thoughts on who it is besides what I've said? I'm actually going to give you a little bit different interpretation that as we get into it today. And I'll say right up front that my interpretation is not a generally accepted interpretation. So you got to take it with a grain of salt. But first of all, let me see. Let me get on my notes here so I don't get too confused. Yeah, so let's go back to Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37. In verse 9. And here we're in the midst of the stories about Joseph. And he has another one of his dreams here in chapter 37, verse 9. That's important for what we're about to read. So 37:9, mine says, Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. And so he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him, saying, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? So here you have the whole family, the mother, the father, and all of the the 11 or 12 children represented in this picture in verse 9, right? You have the sun, the moon, the 11 stars. So that picture then is a picture of Israel at that time. And so when we go back to Revelation chapter 12, you see a very similar picture then. The woman is clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. So the interpretation of this as being Israel certainly makes sense. It's very consistent with the picture that we have back there in Genesis. And it is the traditional interpretation of this woman is Israel, is the Jewish nation. What's interesting is that the more modern interpretation of this woman is of the church. That this is the church, that is the woman here, and represented and has the child, has Christ as a part of that church. And it really comes down to some of the later verses where it talks about the woman, that it seems to fit more with it being the church than it being the nation of Israel. The other comment I would make is that let me just pause that for a minute. Let me go back. So there's two. So the two we mentioned, though, that it's either Israel or it's the church. The third interpretation is that it's actually the Virgin Mary that's being talked about here, right? I mean, she's the one that had the child, and this is being specific about her. When it talks about her fleeing to the wilderness, they say, well, that's her going off to Egypt, to get away from the baby being killed and all that. So those are kind of the three interpretation of this woman. So let me tell you where I come down on this, and it's somewhere kind of in between. And the reason that I come down on this is for a verse that has just become locked in my brain back in Romans chapter 9. So I want you to go back there to Romans chapter 9. We'll begin reading at verse 3. To me, this is a critical piece of doctrine and understanding for me that bends my interpretation of a lot of other things. So I just want you to know where I'm coming from. So in Romans chapter 9, begin at verse 3. We actually read this verse a week or so ago. But here you have Paul saying, "For I wish that I myself were accursed for Christ, for my brethren, my countrymen according to the flesh." So certainly Paul there is talking about his fellow Jews, right? He's saying, "I wish that I could be accursed so that all of them would be okay." In verse 4, right, "Who are Israelites, to whom pertain the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, and the promises." All those things have been given to the Jewish nation. Verse 5, "Of whom are the fathers, and from whom, according to the flesh, Christ came, who is over all, the eternal blessed God. Amen." Right? So that certainly talks about the Jewish nation, talks about Christ coming from the Jewish nation. So that certainly supports this idea that we're talking about the Jewish nation. But keep going in verse 6. Verse 6 says, "But it is not that the word of God has taken no effect, for they are not all Israel who are Israel." That statement to me is very, very important. They are not all Israel who are Israel. Verse 7, "Nor are they all children, because they are seed of Abraham. But in Isaac your seed shall be called." That is, and this is the critical verse, that is, "those who are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of promise are counted as the seed." So as we've talked about before, I think what we have going on here in history, just take the broad sweep of history, is that God had a special relationship with the nation of Israel and those people. But when Christ came, things changed. When Christ came, then there was much more clarity that the chosen people were those who were the seed of Abraham, those who were followed Abraham by faith, which then discluded, which then took away some of those who were Jews because they did not follow after the Messiah, and it also included the Gentiles who believed on Christ. So I believe when he talks about Israel here in verse 6, they are not all Israel who are Israel. The new Israel then is those who have followed after Christ, these believers, those who are of the seed of Abraham, those who are the children of the promise, as talked about in verse 8. So if I think about, okay, who is Israel? I think in the beginning it is the Jewish nation. It is those who have understood who God was and who the Messiah was. Those who then when Christ came, those who accepted him as the Messiah, and then the addition of the Gentiles. All right, having said all that, now let's go back to Revelation chapter 12 and this woman. I believe this woman is Israel. Okay, but when I say the word Israel, I mean the Israel of the promise, right? Not the Jewish nation. It is the Israel of the promise. It's the Israel of Abraham's promise. So I think it is certainly this child who is born of Israel is born out of the Jewish nation, is born out of the Israel that is of the promise, and it is also then the church that includes the Gentiles who have been brought in after that point. So that's where I am in interpreting this. I know that may be a little bit clumsy, but I think it's more consistent with what I think there's been a transition after Christ came and who the understanding of Israel is. And so I think that this woman is that broad spectrum of historical Israel that begins with the Jews and then changes as we get Christ coming.
Hey, Rich.
Pause. Yeah, go ahead.
So is there, I guess I'm trying to decide, is there any issue? I mean, I don't see any issues with actually being able to interpret this, three ways, or, I mean, the way it could be dreamed, it may have been dreamed intentionally to have that you can kind of look at that more than one way just to understand all the different ways God's looking at all of us. Maybe, I don't.
No, I absolutely agree with you, CT, and I think that and the reason I say this, however, is if you look at the commentaries, they usually draw a very hard line, right? And some of them say, this is only the Jewish nation. These are only Jews, okay? Or no, this is only the church. It's not Jews, okay? So I think it's that I think having yourself open to that broader interpretation, as you say, it is the right way to kind of get from this what God is trying to say to us. And I think that even if you hold one view or the other, it's worth thinking about the other views such that you can get the other richness from, I think, what's here in the passage. So I absolutely agree with you there, CT.
Yeah,
I'd say don't get dogmatic in one of those interpretations is my point.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what would be the impact of being dogmatic in one interpretation, and what's the issue of having three different ways to. I don't think it really has an impact either way that I can think of.
Well, I will say this, that there are certainly those, and that I'm listening to John MacArthur, right? John MacArthur, there's no question, he believes this is the Jewish nation, and he gets on that path, and then all of the rest of the interpretation of what we're going to see then is on that path. This is only happening to the Jewish nation. It's not happening to Christians, etc. And I think you miss some richness in what God is trying to tell us by doing that. Or if you exclude the Jewish nation, I think it gets confusing, and it doesn't even make any sense that this is a child of the church. What does that mean? That doesn't make any sense to me. So I think you got to have that broad perspective in order to actually get out of this what God's wanting for us. But that, I just wanted to let you know that's where I am. But I can tell you there's not a commentary that I found that agrees with me. They want to take a side and say it's either this or it's that. So,
Hey, Rich, I would just say that is consistent with the way we've talked about the 144,000 and that interpretation as well.
Yeah, it is. I am being consistent with myself at least, but yeah, I'm just letting you know that most of the commentaries want to take a hard stance here and say, no, it's this side or it's that side or it's something else here. So I just want to be honest with you. Any other thoughts on this before we go on? It's an important point as we go forward. So I just wanted you to. All right, this is actually the hardest person to interpret here. The rest of them are pretty straightforward in understanding who this woman was. I will just go back for a minute here and look at the way this woman is arrayed. Right, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet. The interpretation of that I found most appealing was that clothed with the sun kind of reflects the light, the truth, if you will, but standing on the moon, which is just a reflector of light, which could be, which some of the interpretations say, well, this is showing the woman who has has overcome the false light, right? They're standing on top of the moon, the false light, but they are irradiated with the real light. So again, this is, the point is that these are, what I would say is these are Christians who have seen the true light of God and are not caught up in the world's reflection of the light, the world's false light that is represented by the moon. So I like that connection between the two things there. All right, I think that's enough of the woman. Let's go on to the child. So look at verse 2. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. If you go back to Micah chapter 4, you see very similar words. All I got to do is find Micah chapter 4. No, it's in here. There we go. You don't need to go to it if you don't want, but Micah chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. Let me just read that to you. Again, it says, be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in birth pangs. For now you shall go forth from the city, you shall dwell in the field, and to Babylon you shall go, there you shall be delivered. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. Now also all nations have gathered against you, who say, let her be defiled. Let her eye look upon Zion, but they do not know the thoughts of the Lord, neither do they understand his counsel, for he would gather them like sheaves on the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron, and I will make your hooves bronze, and shall beat into places many peoples, and I will consecrate their gain to the Lord, and their substance to the Lord of the whole earth. So here we have the same kind of language from talking about the birth pains of Israel, right, as they bring forth the Messiah, essentially. So certainly the interpretation that this is Israel makes sense. I've just extended a little bit to broaden the understanding of who Israel is at this time in Revelations with what I've had to say. So here we have this picture then of the pain, the waiting for the deliverance, if you will, which comes in the form of the Messiah. All right, so let's go down to verse 3. We'll come back to the child in a minute when we get down to the birth, down in verse 5, but we take a little side note here because another sign has appeared in verse 3. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, 7 diadems on his head. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as she was born. All right, so we're introduced here to the dragon. And who is the dragon?
Satan.
Yeah, I would say Satan.
Yeah, the dragon is Satan. If you actually go down to verse 9, it actually says that. It actually gives us the answer. Verse 9 says, so the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan. And we'll get to that verse in a little while, but he very clearly identifies that the dragon is Satan. And again, the dragon's not a real dragon. It's a sign that points to the reality of Satan. So you've got these, let's look at the description of him here for a minute. You've got the 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems on his head. Now, when we get into chapter 17, we're going to hear a lot more about this dragon and about the description here. Let me just say this about I keep losing my place. The 7 heads, 7 diadems, right? So 7 heads and 7 diadems are crowns, crowns of kings. So here you have 7 kingdoms, if you will, and 10 horns, which are 10 seats of power. If you remember back to Daniel, those of you who went through the study with us there in Daniel, we talked about the 10 kings. We talked about the 7 kingdoms. So here it is just in a short phrase, you're talking about these 7 kingdoms over the expanse of time, right? You had 7 kingdoms that occurred over time, ending in the final Roman kingdom. And then the 10 kings, if you remember, there were 10 pieces to the Roman kingdom. And so all of that is then represented here in the dragon. So the point is that Satan is being represented as dominating the whole world. He's in charge of all the past kingdoms. He's now in charge of all the current kingdoms, i.e., at this time, the kingdom of the new Rome that is broken into 10 pieces. So it's just a picture to bring that back to us, that Satan is the one who's in charge of the world, in charge of the kingdoms of the world, with this picture of him with the 10 kings and the 7 kings, if you will, 7 kingdoms. Remember again that this is a blood red dragon, indicating his death and destruction. That is what Satan's all about. He's about destroying the people of God, however he can do that. So let me just go back a minute. Go back to 1 John, the book of 1 John, chapter 3. Just to remind you what Satan has been doing. 1 John chapter 3, just go back a couple of pages, verse 11. 1 John chapter 3:11. It's an interesting little phrase here. It says, "For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous." So here you see he goes back and talks about the story of Cain and Abel. Again, we're just looking at the activity of Satan, if you will. And it says here that Cain, who was of the wicked one, right, who was controlled by Satan, why did he kill his brother? Look at the second verse, and that is because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. So this is the beginning of the story of Satan's attack upon the chosen of God. Because his brother was righteous, because his brother was chosen of God, Satan attacks him, and in this particular case, kills him. So we just see Satan's pattern throughout all of history has been to attack God's people. I will remind you, back in Genesis chapter 6, we won't go back and look at the story, that Satan actually sends demons to mate with the women, right? And that they then conceive these creatures. God then the very next chapter, God sends the flood to drown all of them. The whole point there is that God has a plan for human salvation. He doesn't save angels, right? He doesn't save angels, and so these new creatures that were being formed, there was no plan for salvation for them, so God had to destroy all of them. So here again is Satan trying to mess up God's plan. God has a plan for human salvation. Satan tries to mess it up by sending down these demons to mate with women. You can then go on to Exodus chapter 1 and hear about the story about Moses, right? And Moses is born, and God through Pharaoh decides to kill all the boys, right? Because the Israelite nation is getting too large. So again, this is Satan reaching out to try to destroy God's people. And then finally, you see in the fall of Satan, I want you to actually turn there to Isaiah chapter 14. So my only point here is that it has been Satan's work through all of history to destroy God's people. It's nothing new in what we're seeing here at the end. If you go to Isaiah 14, let's look at verse 13. Here is Lucifer, or Satan, in verse 13, saying, "For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the congregation, excuse me, on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High, and yet you shall be brought low down to Sheol." So here you have Satan again. He wants to be in charge. He wants to be king. He wants everybody to look up to him. It's interesting in those verses 13 and 14, you see, I will, I will, I will, I will, I will, right? Satan all focused on himself and what will happen, and what he wants to become. And so it's been his desire always to be in charge, to have everybody bow down and worship him. And we're seeing the same thing here as we look at what he's doing. All right, so let's go on to verse 4 back in Revelation chapter 4, and we'll see how the story continues.
Hey, Rich.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. I may be getting ahead. The Satan with the 7 heads and the 7 crowns, does that correspond with the 7 trumpets at some point?
No, not really. It really is the 7 kingdoms over time.
Okay.
That we looked at in Daniel. We'll go back and look at that when we get to chapter 17, but no, it's not the 7 trumpets. It really is the 7 eras or epochs of time that has brought us to current.
Well, I didn't know, not necessarily that it was the trumpets, but that each trumpet was towards each kingdom. So, but I understand. It's just a thought.
Yeah, I haven't heard that before, so
Okay.
It's a thought. All right, so let's go to verse 4. So again, we're still talking about the dragon. It says his tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. So here, I think we have this, what is often called the fall of Satan. This is when Satan is recognized as as being evil. We were just back there in Isaiah chapter, where were we? Chapter 14. You don't need to turn back there again, but what I didn't read, I read verses 13 and 14. If you're still there, verse 12 before that, it says, how you are fallen, O Lucifer. How are you fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How are you cut down from the ground, you who weaken the nations? Then it goes on into the, you have said, I will, I will, I will, I will. So here it's identified as Satan, as he is identified as someone who used to be an angel, used to be a cherub, as we mentioned earlier, who is now tried to exalt himself. We see a similar story in Ezekiel chapter 28. Ezekiel 28, verse 14. Right? Ezekiel 28:14 says, you were the anointed cherub who covers, I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of the fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created till the iniquity was found in you. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. And therefore I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I laid you before kings that they might gaze on you. You defiled your sanctuaries by the multitude of your iniquities, by the iniquity of your trading. Therefore I brought fire from your midst. It devoured you, and it turned you to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all who saw you. So here we actually have the whole picture of what happens to Satan from him being recognized, being him thrown out of heaven, and being destroyed here in Ezekiel. And then finally, if you want to go back to Daniel and see a similar picture in Daniel chapter 8.
Can't be right.
Daniel chapter 8, we'll try to find it here. Yeah, chapter 8, verse 8.
Right.
Chapter 8, verse 8. If you remember this part of the story, it says, therefore the male goat grew very strong, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in its place 4 notable ones came up from the 4 winds of heaven, and out of one of them came a little horn. So here we have the story of the little horn, who is the Antichrist, representative of Satan here, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. It grew up at the host of heaven. It was cast down, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifice, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered, etc., etc. So here again, you have the story through the picture of the Antichrist of the fall of Satan. So you do notice here that the host of heaven came with him. Here back then in Revelation chapter 12, verse 4, we see that it was a third of the stars. So a third of the angelic beings join Satan in his rebellion. I will say that at this point in time, and there is some conversation about this, but my interpretation is that at this point in time, Satan is recognized as evil. He rebels, and he begins working against God and against his purposes. Period, at the end of the sentence. We'll see that the reason I say that is we'll see when we get down to verse 7 that he is actually thrown out of heaven permanently. Here he is recognized, but he's thrown out of heaven permanently when we get down to verse 7. And I'll explain that when we get down there. All right, so we take a little pause here. Wow, look what time it is. How did you guys let it be that time already? Let me finish up 5 and 6 at least, so we have a consistent conversation, and then we'll certainly be done by 10:30. Verse 5, she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God in his throne. So who are we talking about here? This is the easy one.
Jesus.
Thank you, Debbie. Yes,
Well,
so this is this is Jesus, right? I was just looking at something else, but this is Jesus. He's the son of the woman. And I will say this, in spite of all of Satan's efforts, right, throughout all of the Israelite history to destroy the line of Jesus, right, the line of David, the line of Jesus, all the way back to, Cain and Abel, through Moses, to all the times when it was down to, Joseph and one person left who actually was following after God. God protected the line of Jesus such that this child actually does get born. I mean, Satan has tried repeatedly to crush this line over and over again in various ways, but the child is born here in verse 5, regardless of Satan's effort. Now, you remember I read in Micah a bit ago. It talked about the rod of iron. We see a similar kind of picture. You remember last time we talked about Psalm 2. I'm not going to go back there and read it again today, but Psalm 2 is a great picture of what's going on here, and again talks about him breaking them with a rod of iron. So here you have this child who is born. Part of the reason is to rule all the nations and rule them with a rod of iron, to crush the rest of the kingdoms, if you will, as we've seen in Daniel. And then the last of the verses, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. What is that referring to? The child was caught up to God and his throne. Any thoughts?
say it.
Say it, Russell.
Say it, Russell.
God took Jesus back to heaven, took him home.
Yeah. So what's interesting here in this verse, we have the birth of Christ. We have thank you, Russell. That was good. We have the birth of Christ. We have the ultimate reign of Christ in the end times, and then we also have the ascension of Christ when he goes to be, after the resurrection, when he goes to be with God. We have three significant events in Christ's life talked about here. What's interesting is his whole life and death are not described in this verse, right? But his birth, his ascension, and his ultimate rule are in this verse. So this chapter 12 is very much a sweep through history. We've gone all the way back to Cain and Abel, to the throwing out of Satan from heaven. Here we have the birth, the ascension, the rule of Christ, all in one verse. It's very much a very broad sweep. And then we have in verse 6, then the woman fled into the wilderness. Wait a minute, did I forget something? Yeah. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So here again, we get back into this conversation about the interpretation when we see what is happening here. So the woman who fled into the wilderness, so is this the Israelite nation that flees into the wilderness? Is this all of the saved people who flee into the wilderness? Is this the Virgin Mary who flees into the wilderness? And again, if you'll notice, it's the 1,260 days, which we know is 42 months, 3.5 years, right? That we've talked about before. So this is the Great Tribulation time, if you will. Let me tell you what I believe, but I'll give you some other stuff too. What I believe here, we are talking about, again, all Israel. When I say all Israel, I mean the new Israel, right, that we talked about in Romans, that they are going to be protected. They're going to be drawn into the wilderness or protected by God during the Great Tribulation. I think that's consistent with everything that we've seen back to chapter 7, back to the beginning of chapter 11, where the saints are sealed and protected during the tribulation. I think that's exactly what's going on here. There are, one interpretation we haven't talked about in a while, but there are those who believe that we are in the tribulation now, that it actually started when after Christ's resurrection, and will complete when the seventh trumpet sounds, and that this 1,260 days is just a symbol of all time between Christ's resurrection and the seventh trumpet. And I can tell you that's a very popular contemporary interpretation of the end times. So I don't want you to just completely ignore that. So they're saying we're in the middle of that, and that God is protecting us today, protecting our salvation, if you will, today, while Satan is active on the land. All right. So then we hear about the woman. I do want to read to you verses 7 through 9 and introduce that, and let you ponder it for the next time we get together, which will be in 2 weeks to talk about this. But look at verses 7 to 9. It says, "And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." We'll talk a lot about that casting out in verse 9 when we get back to this. But the thing I actually want you to ponder is what just happened? We were talking about the woman. We were talking about the male child. She flees into the wilderness. And then all of a sudden, we're back in heaven. And we're talking about this war that breaks out between Michael and his angels who fought against the dragon and the dragon's angels. I got to ask why? Why all of a sudden have we changed perspectives and we're in heaven talking about this battle that's going on when we were simply talking about the woman and the child and all that's going on down there in history? So that's the question I want you to think about as to why we have made this turn, and then we will certainly get into the details of 7 through 9 through 12 through the end of the chapter as we continue the rest of this. So I guess the thing again that I want to end with, and it is the overwhelming theme of Revelation, is that even in the midst of this picture of this great red dragon who's come to destroy, who's come to sit at the feet of Israel as the Messiah is born to try to destroy the child. In the midst of that, the child is saved, the child is glorified, the child is brought to heaven. The woman who is representative, I believe, of the new Israel is protected in the wilderness in the midst of this tribulation. So the good news for us is that there is hope. There is a sense in which we are protected as we go forward, either in this life or in the life to come, and that's good news. So, any comments or questions on this before we wrap it up? All right, this is some tricky stuff that we're in the middle of here. And let me just say again from the beginning, I am not a Revelation scholar. I am learning as I'm going, and feel free to push back or bring other thoughts in, because we're all learning together as we go through this. I will say that I'm getting more and more clarity in my own mind as to what's going on here, and often it's not consistent with what's in the commentaries, which is very interesting. I may have to write a commentary when we get done. Maybe one of you will do that for me, because that's not something I ever want to do. But anyway, it's been fun kind of going through this and learning. All right, anything before we close? Any additional prayer requests or anything we need to know before we shut this down? What you do, babe?
I
tonight.
just wanted to bring up a comment going back to when you first started this study, that you focused it or framed it on what the book of Revelation has to tell us to live our lives today, and not to get bogged down in the minutia of what does the dragon mean, and what are the seven tails, and what are the seven trumpets, and that just I was thinking about that this week when I was doing some reading, and it's I think as we get into this chapter especially, and going forward, we really need to focus on that. What does this tell us about how to live our lives today?
It's good, Rick. It's a good reminder. Thank you. Joe?
Tonight at 8, I don't know if y'all seen it, but there's supposed to be a really good concert and speaking and all called Hope Rising Live.
There's a
At
bunch
8
of
o'clock.
Christian artists and preachers it looks like it's going to be a pretty good event. But it looks like it's all online, so you need to find it on Facebook or something to find the link for it. I think was it Hope Rising
Live.
No, something else. Anyway, find it. It's worth doing a search on it. Hope Rising. It looks like a pretty good concert. Anything else? All right, folks. Have a good week. Enjoy the service in front of us, and we'll talk with y'all later. Love you now. Bye now.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good week.